Let's talk about Legend by David Gemmell. So 1984 was a big year for me. I wasn't quite born, but apart from Mythigo Wood, which was released that year, the review is on this channel, another book was released, Legend, David Gemmell's debut novel. And I've read it, I think, 3 or 4 times, which is nearly the most I've read any fiction. Now, here's the background, I guess. David Gemmell had cancer, and he wanted to write a book about fighting the darkness, about dealing with what he thought then were unbeatable odds. Now, he survived cancer, he kept writing for over 20 years, and his Drenai cycle in general is amazing. That's what led him to write this. He writes heroic fantasy, so this is heroic fantasy. The David Gemmell Award was, for a decade, the benchmark award in heroic fantasy, and it went to people from Brandon Sanderson to Brent Weeks, all the way to the anti-heroic fantasy of Joe Abercrombie. And I think the top review on this book on Goodreads is by Patrick Rothfuss, who I think received it, read it after kind of being nominated for the David Gemmell Award. And it's a very simple story. It's about a tiny army led by a band of heroes holding a strong natural fortress against a great horde of barbarians who must conquer. If they lose, and they have to lose, their nation is doomed. That's the plot. But the defenders have, very specifically, the legend, Druss the legend. And there's a great story about how Gemmell came up with the character Druss, that basically he had a stepfather, Bill, and Bill was a kind of very strong and heroic figure to him. A story he tells is that he went to Bill and he couldn't sleep, and Bill said to him, what's wrong, son? And he said, it's the vampires under my bed or in my closet. And I'm just really scared that if I go there, the vampire will eat me. And Bill says, oh yeah, I know about the vampire. And David said, oh, what do you mean? What's happened? He said, oh yeah, I know about the vampire. I broke his effing neck. And David, of course, could go to sleep again because he knew that he was being looked after. So Druss is a figure based loosely on his stepfather, Bill, who gave him a safe place to be. Up front, we should talk about some weaknesses, partly because I'm not going to talk about weaknesses very much. The writing style is very pulpy. The number of times over the course of the books, Gemmell says something like, his eagle eyes looked out over the landscape, or whatever, something like that. Eagle eyes is a particular bugbear of mine, but there are other tics as well. You can tell he has favoured phrases, and he doesn't really care about world building. It's a very workable world. It's fine. There's some interesting cultural differences. There's no real depth, and there's a tiny bit of kind of moving on in terms of thinking about what the world is later in the series, in the cycle. But it's not a particularly important thing. Similarly with the magic isn't super deep. It's effective, pulpy, soft magic. But the strength, that said, the strengths are numerous. Plot, I'd say, story, and character. So at least 3 big strengths. The action is great. I should say as well. Gemmell did say that if it hadn't been for his religious faith, he would have probably written amoral, immoral, Western violence or fantasy violence or whatever genre he went into, the kinds of novels that he loved reading when he was younger. So his action is great, but it's tempered by these other things. The plots are, are they great? I think they're great, but in a way, they're very predictable. There's virtually always, in Gemmell, not always, but virtually always, a band of heroes and a tiny force fighting against impossible odds to achieve something. That's what the Drenai cycle does particularly. It's not true of all of his novels, but particularly with the Drenai cycle, impossible odds, tiny army. That's the big gimmick he has, or tiny band of heroes. But he executes it all so well. I very rarely come across a writer who executes his plots so well, in my view at least. And he modulates, he does slightly different things. He's like a composer coming up with variations on the same tune or same theme. And Legend is maybe the archetypal heroic fantasy plot, but it's executed so well. It gives so much space to the characters. So talking about the characters are sometimes they're trope characters. There's, is he the lost earl of something, or is he the chosen one? There's female characters, barbarian characters you expect to be simplistic because they look simplistic. She's the sexy femme fatale or whatever. There's a great in Legend. There's a great barbarian character, a couple of great barbarian characters of different barbarian cultures, inverted commas. But then there's so much depth, and in fact, there's a range of surprises when it comes to characters. He comments on tropes. All the characters are tropes, but they are perfectly and freshly executed and spun. For instance, there's an aristocrat sent to command troops for nepotistic reasons, but who humbles himself and finds himself a place with the professionals, who earns himself a place with the professionals. There's an order of monks who train for the battle in which they are all going to die, or all but one of them is going to die, and they're led by a monk who is doubting his own faith, and he doesn't know why he's leading them. And the barbarian lord who's leading the big army is in fact the most civilized character in the whole series, or in the whole book, sorry, and indeed the whole series. There's a reason you see him like that, and you meet him again elsewhere. And then there's Druss. And I think Druss may be the best character in heroic fantasy. Gemmell ended up writing 2 full sequels about Druss. He guest stars in another book, and there's a sort of sequel to Druss's Legend as well in a later novel. But the best book is this one. The others are good, so I don't mean, it goes downhill. In fact, Gemmell's writing improves and probably his plotting improves. But this is probably the best book. And in this, Druss is scared of dying. He's old, his wife has died, he's on his own, and he's being taunted by death. It seems literally he has visions of death taunting him. You're going to die in your bed, you're not going to die with axe in hand. So he gets up to fight one last doomed fight. But that's the thing, there's a question that haunts the book. Is Druss actually a hero? Is he really like Gemmell's stepfather Woodford? Or is he just another killer with pretensions? Well, you have to read it to find out. But I should say, finally, the morality, the philosophy that I mentioned, where Gemmell, his own beliefs, do come into it in a way. Gemmell wants to work out questions of faith, morality, what heroism is. He doesn't always give simple answers. He doesn't, certainly they're not cheap answers. He wrestles, and he sometimes is a bit explicit about it, but he always earns his moral or philosophical conclusions. So in conclusion, Gemmell is special. He offers a very alternative route in heroic fantasy to what a lot of people read nowadays, I think. Or at least what some people read nowadays. Obviously, there's a massive variety of books out there. And here's a big thing. It's not post-Tolkien epic heroic fantasy. It's not... so Dark Tower, Stephen Covenant, Sword of Shannara, Sword of Truth, Wheel of Time, those things are post-Tolkien and very much explicitly post-Tolkien heroic epic fantasy. But nor is it a traditional sword and sorcery book. It's not like Conan. It's maybe a bit more like Lankmar, which I'll talk about at a later date, I think. But it's got a beating moral heart that is a lot more subtle than most of those other sword and sorcery books. Or Imaro is another good comparison, actually. It's passionate. It's full of emotions. It always makes me cry. And it's the start of a really enjoyable cycle. And indeed, it has Druss. And Druss himself is more than enough. If you've read it, what did you think? Tell me in the comments. Till next time.